After France was finally forced to withdraw its forces from Mali, where 9 years have been connected within what was called Barkhan's Force, questions continued about the future with international powers. Its influence on the continent is increasing at the expense of French influence. The beginning of French ambitions in Africa was after a series of defeats of the famous French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte a third of the lands of the continent. After France was previously focused on East Asian regions through the French East India Company, Africa became the location of the new colonial influence, and France occupied Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco and Mauritania in the north of the continent, and other countries in the west and central of the continent occupied Senegal, Mali, Togo, Guinea-Conakry, Benin and Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Niger, Chad, Comoros, Central Africa, Madagascar, Gabon, parts of Gambia and others. Since the mid-20th century, the colonial wave led by France, Britain in particular, began to evacuate the countries it occupied, but France has remained crouching on many African countries in one way or another, even if its occupied armies have already withdrawn. The French forces withdrew from the Brown Continent or almost, but Paris imposed a kind of political and economic patriarchy, and they did not withdraw from their colonies until after its language was imposed on it to become the French language and the language of education in nearly half of the African countries, which made these countries remain under a kind of colonialism. Cultural was helped by the creation of the so-called Francophone Society. France also imposed on these countries to deal with the African franc, which is printed and determined its purchasing power by Paris, in addition to the acquisition of the most important economic assets and controlling the main services such as water supplies, electricity and phone, as well as transportation, ports, banking institutions and even trade and agriculture. The African franc trading is taking place in 12 countries that were formerly French colonies, in addition to Guinea-Bissau, a previous Portuguese colony, and Equatorial Guinea, a previous Spanish colony, and the trading franc is divided into two types, Central Africa Francia Francity West Africa, knowing that both of them cannot be used in the other area. According to the agreements of France with these countries, the central bank for each African country is committed to maintaining a large percentage that may exceed 50% of its cash reserves from foreign currencies in a commercial account in the French central bank, where these countries do not have the right to put their hand on these funds or exploit it. Then she had to have nothing but borrowing from the French cabinet. Some estimates indicate that, thanks to this control, the French treasury earns about $500 billion annually of profits and returns coming from Africa. According to Senegalese historian and researcher Mustafa Dieng, the pumping of colonial money into the French treasury dates back to the 19th century, when the population of the colonies was paying the so-called heads of head tax to France, a tax imposed on every person and his property, basic and livestock, and they are paid personally or local actors collect it. The researcher added to the Anatolia Agency that the extraction of property and the spirit of slavery are still one of the elements that constitute the foundations of French policy, and that one of the repercussions of this is obstructing the progress of its previous colonies, which it considers merely a back garden for it. He stressed that this situation is based on treaties with public and secret terms that still direct French-African relations and serve the interests of the strongest party in the equation at the expense of the interests of African countries and nations, although this treaty has signed in other eras that exceeded time, he said. In fact, the French ambitions were not secret, so the leaders who punished the rule of France expressed the importance of the Brown Continent for their country, as President Charles de Gaulle was keen to take direct supervision of the African affairs file, which has become a tradition that passes its successors, while President François went on Mitterrand in 1994 to say that France will not have a 21st century history without Africa. But what the French did not realize that Africa may have developed a lot in recent decades, while the colonial mentality of Paris did not develop in the same extent, so it continued to look at the brown continent as a mine of wealth and a source of benefit, without cost itself the trouble of applying the criteria that it always talks about: freedom and a positive brotherhood for Africa. The position on the coups that took place in several African countries was revealing, as France had more than one measure, so she supported those who found that it was in its favor, while she opposed those who saw it otherwise, so its declared principles appeared at one time and disappeared at another time. The French fall in Africa was not only related to the actions of France, its decisions, or even its decline in its European environment, but also found some of his tributaries in international powers that began to turn its attention towards the brown continent and hope that it will also receive some gains. And after France was the only player in Africa, it has in every foothold or more competitors. Russian interest in Africa is not new as some people might think, but rather dates back to the 1950s when Moscow supported the outbreak of the endeavor to get rid of colonialism, and then returned in the last decade to search again for the positions of influence of Adraka from it for the geopolitical and economic importance of the brown continent. Recent years have witnessed Russian attempts to build new influence sites in different parts of Africa, and Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed this when he said that the development of relations with the countries of the continent has become one of the priorities of Russian foreign policy. According to a study published at the Al Jazeera Center for Studies last year, Russia is trying to penetrate into Africa by being in ports overlooking the Red Sea and building military bases in strategic areas on African beaches to enter the continent, to compete with the Western alliances deployed in the region and obtain shares from the continent's resources. It provides logistical services, political, diplomatic support, defense and security assistance, especially through the mercenaries of the Wagner Company, economic and experiences of control and epidemics, and some training in the field of education and technology. China, and if the West in front of France has imposed its influence on Africa by force of weapons, China, which has quietly proceeded to be a global pole, has in recent years and calmly extended its control in several areas of the continent, but through the soft power. In recent years, China has become the largest commercial partner for Africa, and hundreds of its companies are working on the continent, and China has become a major funding for the many countries of Africa, which is largely relying on the China-Africa Cooperation Forum, which was established about 2 decades ago. The matter is not limited to the economy, but rather extends to military and cultural aspects, where there is a Chinese base in Djibouti and is spreading in many countries of the continent, Chinese language teaching centers. Turkey, as for Turkey, was the latest guest on the African continent in recent years, and it seemed clear that its influence there is increasingly, and the most exciting part of it comes at the expense of the French cake, whose size seems to be shrinking in the brown continent. In its influence on the brown continent, Ankara depends on economic and commercial projects as well as religious ties, and to the lowest security in military, and reports indicate that Turkish companies have entered into supply agreements with the armies of several African countries that were under the tutelage of France and their companies. History and present, modern history in the brown continent, indicates that France has been clinging to the gains that it has forcibly obtained thanks to their occupation of these countries and the following of the independence agreements, then by preserving strong relations with dictatorship regimes that clown the breaths of the peoples of these countries. History also tells us that the countries that tried to get out of the French control circle faced military coups or masterminds, as well as direct targeting of their economy. However, the matter began to witness a clear change in the past years, especially with the change of power in Mali and in neighboring countries in a way that is not in the interest of France and opened the door to the extension of the influence of other powers, most notably Russia. France's withdrawal from Mali recently came after a military operation that lasted for a full 9-year-old, on the pretext of fighting what Paris described as hardline Islamists, to represent a major step and a crucial indication of the decline in French influence in Africa, and most importantly, it may be a fan of other countries. The matter is not only related to the withdrawal of the previous superpower, but also to the failure of its mission in Mali, as the process that came years ago with the aim of eliminating armed Islamic groups ended by France without achieving the goal. But more than half of the country's area is under the control of these groups. Even the official authority has become hostile to France. To become the only French success, perhaps it enables it to withdraw quietly.